And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Aviation Weather Outlook on this Wednesday, September 4th, 2024. And this outlook is for Thursday and Friday. So to start out Thursday morning, we are watching an area of low pressure on this Wednesday that's going to come up out of the North Pacific up into the Western Gulf and then eventually pull back toward lower Cook Inlet and weaken. This system does have some gale force winds with it along a frontal system that'll push up along the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast and then into the Panhandle with some areas of moderate to locally heavy rain. Meanwhile, as we go through the day Thursday, there's going to be a secondary low sitting back here over the southeast Bering, Kuskokwim Bay area that's just going to kind of pivot back out into the Western Gulf over Kodiak Island and into the Western Gulf as we go into Friday and just kind of take the place of the low that'll be moving up into there as we go through late this Wednesday and on Thursday. Meanwhile, we expect VFR conditions across much of the interior, but IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast will be spreading north and eastward. We do still have some gusty winds this Wednesday through the Alaska Range. There have been some wind advisories, and then out here toward the west along the west coast, extensive IFR conditions extending across much of the Bering Sea into the eastern and central Aleutians. By Thursday afternoon, we do find with some of that moisture being pulled up along the south slopes here of the Alaska Range, some IFR conditions from like around Windy Pass down through Rainy Pass. We have IFR conditions, Prince William Sound along the northeastern Gulf Coast, outer Panhandle, inner coastal mountains here for areas of the Panhandle, and then back out to the west, a lot of IFR there along the southwest coast, Bering Strait, and out in through the Bering and central Aleutians. For Friday morning, still generally VFR conditions across the Yukon, Tanana valleys. We do anticipate IFR conditions holding areas of Cook Inlet along the Kenai coastline, northern, northeastern Gulf Coast into areas of the central Panhandle, some IFR in the inner channels, Stevens Passage. Back to the west, still IFR along much of the west coast. Try to come inland a bit here into the lower YK Delta, and then IFR across much of the Bering Sea. For Friday afternoon, still some lingering IFR conditions along the outer Panhandle coast, areas of the northwest Gulf Coast, just outside of Prince William Sound, also areas of the central Alaska Range, especially the southern slopes, and then extensive IFR conditions expected Friday afternoon along the Arctic coast down through the Bering Strait, all along the southwest coast. And there's going to be yet a broader frontal system that moves in across the Bering here early in the weekend that'll have with it, again, some gustier winds, areas of light to moderate rain, and extensive IFR conditions. So a quick check of past conditions on Thursday. Start out MVFR, Anatuvik Pass becoming VFR. That's just early in the day. Adigan Pass, MVFR earlier in the morning becoming VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill should generally hold on to MVFR conditions on Thursday. As we round up toward the central Alaska Range, Rainy Pass becoming IFR as we get into the midday afternoon. And the same thing, Windy Pass could see conditions become IFR with that upslope glide flow that they're getting, which would tend to reduce the ceilings and visibilities. Isabel Pass, VFR, becoming MVFR, and then further east, Mentasta Pass should be able to hold on to VFR conditions during the day Thursday. And Tanita Pass is kind of on that tightrope between VFR conditions across more of the northern portion of the Copper River Valley to MVFR conditions as you go further south toward Prince William Sound. And Portage Pass is generally looking MVFR on Thursday, maybe a little VFR toward the west entrance, especially early in the day, but generally speaking, there and out toward Prince William Sound, MVFR. And then finally, northern portion of the Panhandle with that frontal system working its way eastward, increasing moisture, upslope glide. We expect MVFR conditions to become IFR during the day at both Chilkoot and White. Looking at freezing levels aloft, coldest air is off to the north and west over eastern Russia. That's where we have some surface freezing temperatures as well as aloft to 4,000 foot freezing levels. Kind of a broader troughiness here that extends out across much of the Bering into the mainland. Even some pockets here. We have the surface freezing line, the Wrangell St. Elias Mountains there at the surface. And again, as we go west, there's a pocket of a little lower freezing levels aloft here in the eastern Aleutians, lower portion of the Bering Sea. And then freezing levels do rise considerably, still over northwest Canada, above 12,000 feet to start Thursday morning. Southern portion of the Panhandle, Haida Gwaii, and even above 14,000 feet as you head toward Vancouver Island. For Thursday, icing potential with this initial low coming up here into the western Gulf and weakening over Prince William Sound. We find ahead of it the frontal system here that will also have some gale force winds. Above 8,000 feet, there could be moderate icing along the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast. Above 10,000 feet, central outer portion of the Panhandle, above 10,000 feet there, and then back toward the west along the Alaska Range and back toward the lower Yukon basin there, generally above 6,000 feet, and that would extend northward up along areas of the Brooks Range. Little higher freezing levels along the Alcan border above 8,000 feet because of that warmer ridging here over northwest Canada. So here at 30,000 feet jet stream level, you can see some ridging here over central Canada. Broad troughiness here over Alaska mainland back here and through the eastern Aleutians and our eastern Bering, including the Bering Strait, with our jet core in excess of 100 knots south of the Alaska Peninsula and south of the Aleutians in the North Pacific. For Thursday at 9,000 feet mid-levels, a broad belt of winds just coming down here across the Aleutians and then curving back up to the northeast across the lower Gulf. And even coming up in, this is why along areas of the Alaska Range, there could be some turbulence as a result of that southerly flow ahead of that particular frontal system or trough, and then a broad area of winds 35 to 50 knots there over northwest Canada. As we bring it, though, down to 3,000 feet, we find the greatest concentration of winds. There's two lows, the one that's going to be weakening here over Lower Cook Inlet on Thursday, and another one back here that's going to kind of pivot and take its place on Friday. And as we would expect along this front, we could see some gale force winds, 30,000 feet, 35 to as high as 45 knots. Back to the west of the and southwest of the lows, we find northerly flow over the Aleutians, tip of the Alaska Peninsula, 35 to 40 knots with a pocket of higher winds, 45 knots there south of the eastern Aleutians and south of the Alaska Peninsula. So in this setup, the greatest threat for moderate turbulence will be along areas of the Gulf Coast, especially including the Kenai Peninsula, maybe even into the Chugach Mountains around Prince William Sound eastward through Yakutat at surface to 6,000 feet. And then as we go further back toward the west, we could see some moderate turbulence. St. Matthew, the Pribilof Islands down here, especially in through the eastern and central portion of the Aleutians. Look for the potential for moderate turbulence, surface to 3,000 feet.